actually is a follow-up question that is related to grazing and grazing rest and how long that should be. Now, if you go into the literature and you look at what is out there, people talk about the policy that has been set up that once a fire takes place that we remove livestock for a minimum of 2 years. Now, that may be agreed upon policy. I'm not sure that it is actually written in law, but you know, where does that come from, and why do we use that, and what should we even be thinking about relative to that? But I think it really goes to show that in some of the areas that we work in, this is one of those areas where there really needs to be a direct connection between some of the research community and the management community on trying to develop a better solution for looking at this, rather than just to say 2 years is plenty and we move on from there. So how do we set the objectives for grazing and resumption on these areas, regardless of whether they've just burned and they are going to recover on their own, or whether we're going to go in and do a rehabilitation onto those areas? And I'm going to split those into 2 separate questions because one has been addressed much more than another has. The 2-year minimum rest is the issue that we're really dealing with, and why do we have that, and what are the objectives that we're trying to achieve with it? And then that then falls back to how would one actually set objectives from a management standpoint at which they could use to be able to determine whether it's an appropriate time to resume livestock grazing on an area. And then the question comes up, are there good definitive studies that are out there that either state that something other than 2 years would be sufficient? You know, are there ways in which we could use livestock grazing and be able to apply them in shortly after a fire, within 1 year, let's say, and not do damage to the landscape, or at least not have any appreciable impact that could be impacting that area? Well, first what I'd like to do is really look at how plants respond to fire, because this is one of the major areas that we're trying to get at, and the response, the immediate response to fire, determines the stress that the plant has taken associated with the heat and exposure to the fire. And that needs to be put into the context of both the fire regime or the specific fire that has occurred on that area, and then how do plants in general respond to it. We use terms, and oftentimes these are thrown around quite loosely, things like fire severity. And when we talk about fire severity, if I was to use that term, really what I'm referring to are changes in ecosystem properties that have occurred. This could be merely a major change in, let's say, species composition on a landscape, but it could in fact be to others properties associated with hydrology and the ability for that land to be able to take up water after a fire. Most of the fire severity work most recently has been more related to remote sensing imagery, and so therefore major changes in plant composition is usually what we're talking about with fire severity and fire severity indices. However, another term that's oftentimes thrown around in conjunction with fire severity is that of fire intensity, and that really is relating to the energy that's released by the fire. And this is the one that really impacts the plant's ability to be able to respond after a fire. It's the temperatures that are achieved by that plant, and then therefore that may or may not be lethal, or may not have caused problems associated with the growth of that plant later after the fire. And another aspect associated with fire regime that's an important one from looking at plant responses is the fire residency time. That deals with the length of time that the actual burning is taking place, and then that's the length of time of exposure to high temperatures that a plant may experience. So there are plants can actually have lethal effects at lower temperatures if the length of time that the plant is exposed to a temperature is much longer than a very short hot fire. And so residency time can enter into the issue along with the intensity of the fire. And then how much biomass is actually consumed. A very quick fire that's moving across the landscape, being blown by winds, may in fact move across the fine fuel very quickly and only burn off the top portions of the plants or the litter, and may not actually burn down into the root crowns or into the bases of some of the plants. And so biomass consumption is a portion of what impacts then the plant and the plant response. From the plant's point of view, the growth buds, and those are the buds of growth after the fire, and their locations as to whether they're located above or at or below the soil surface are really the important factors for regrowth after a fire. If the plant lives, it's usually those buds that will be the growing points for the plant to continue to maintain itself on that area. And so for residual plants after a fire, they have to have those buds viable and available for regrowth to occur. And it will depend upon the type of fire that occurs on an area. So a crown fire that burns through and does not get onto the soil surface isn't going to affect those plants that are on the soils. And then that's why the converse of that would be a ground fire that, or a surface fire that burns across the soil surface might impact the herbaceous community, but may not impact trees in a location because their buds could in fact be above the soil surface. So the location of those buds becomes a real important factor, and some plants have those buds located below the soil, or they're protected by the actual soil itself, or at the soil surface, or above the soil surface where they're very likely to be exposed to the burning itself. Insulation from heat, certainly the most commonly referred to plant part that insulates a plant against heat is bark on trees. And a classic example of that is ponderosa pine, and the bark of the ponderosa pine protecting the ability for the xylem and phloem of the plant to be maintained and continue to allow growth to take place. In some cases, overlapping leaves can protect a growing point of a plant, and that's a common one in some of the Florida areas, but not so much out here in the western U.S. And then the last resort for many plants is the seed bank. Those plants that are very susceptible and are killed by fire, such as sagebrush, have to rely on the seed bank to be able to reestablish themselves, or rely on seed dispersal into the burned area in order to be reestablished on those areas. And so these factors associated with plant responses after fire really relate to those kinds of factors that we believe are necessary for residual plants excuse me, after a fire to be able to grow and reestablish in a location. So a couple of photographs to try and illustrate some of this. The photograph on the upper left is one of the fire burning through an area, going through a shrub grassland system. And anytime when we have woody plants that are burning, they tend to burn hotter than the grasses themselves. So generally, the heat that is exchanged in and around the shrub itself tends to be much hotter, and therefore transfers a lot more heat into the ground, and so may in fact be more detrimental to the herbaceous plant community that might in fact be able to survive a similar type fire if the woody plants had not been there. And so an herbaceous community with a continuous overstory of shrubby plants may be much more susceptible to injury from fire and mortality from fire than a community that has only a sparse representation of woody plants within it. The other photograph in the lower right is really trying to show you what happens in terms of residency time on fires. And so with the shrubs and the woody plant material, you get along with it litter that is built up on the soil. And the flames will in fact continue to burn through that litter as well as continuing to burn through the woody plant material, continuing then to put heat into the soil in and around that area of the woody plant. Some locations you can go into an area after a fire and you see areas that have white ash associated with where the shrubs have been, and those tend to be areas that have burned hotter than those areas with black ash associated with them. And so this becomes important when we have situations where the perennial grasses or forbs might mostly be associated with and around the shrubs themselves. Those plants may be much more susceptible to fire kill than plants that were much more exposed. So what's the goal then in terms of post-fire grazing rest? What are we trying to achieve with this? And staying away from doing any kind of rehabilitation or restoration aspects and just looking at the recovery of the residual plants, well, how do we even determine what is a recovered plant? Do we use things like the number of culms on a grass plant? Or does that grass plant, must it get back to a point of being reproductive and producing inflorescences? So those are questions that really have not been directly addressed in terms of ways of being able to look at plants. However, there have been studies that have used these as some sort of surrogate to look at how well the plant has responded after a fire. And then regeneration. I mentioned inflorescence production, but if due to the fire there has been mortality associated with plants, either plants that were truly susceptible or more susceptible to the fire, or in some cases, with the herbaceous community, certain grasses may be more susceptible to fire than other grasses. Then in those particular cases, it could be that you're going to have to require seeds on that area for recovery to take place and to bring those populations back to the levels that they were and to the densities that they were prior to the fire. That's not to say that we have to get them all back to that level, but that potentially we would like the residual plants that have survived to begin to produce seeds so that we have the areas that are voids that are in that landscape that have been opened up due to mortality of certain plants, that there will be desirable perennial plants in that community that will produce seeds and be available to begin to refill those gaps that have been created. So therefore, seeds may be an important factor to be looking at, and therefore seedlings as well. But we have to recognize that seed production and seedling establishment is a fairly patchy thing that occurs over time. And not every year is a good year for producing seeds, and not every year is a good year for producing seedlings. The last thing is really getting away from the actual plants themselves and the replacement of those plants or the growth of those plants, but the ability for those plants that have been retained on the landscape to actually once again cover the landscape enough to prevent erosion from taking place. And so some people have argued that one of the things that needs to be looked at would be the amount of cover that is being provided by these plants in terms of the prevention of erosion. And this wouldn't just be the cover of the plants themselves, but also the cover due to litter that those plants are producing. So what happens in a grazing episode? What do we know about the grass plants, let's say, because of the dominance of grass plants in the Intermountain West? What do we know about grass plants, and how do they actively grow, and what grazing can potentially do to them? Well, I'm going to break this into two parts. One that occurs when the grazing episode is occurring during active growth, but before or during the boot stage of the plant, the stage at which the inflorescence here would be moving up through the culm of the plant itself. If grazing occurs at the time where this inflorescence has begun to move up through the culm and the livestock defoliates the plant at that level, then what has happened is that the apical bud of the plant has actually been removed associated with that particular culm, that particular tiller. And so what then occurs is there will be some stimulation of auxiliary shoots formed from buds at the base of these lower leaves, and those will begin to regrow almost immediately, provided that there's adequate moisture that will take place. Reestablishment of those buds, then those tillers will start to grow up, and they have to get large enough to actually set new buds, which become the growing points for new tillers in the following year. So it's this bud dynamics associated with plants and the resetting of buds for tiller development that becomes very important if the grazing removes the apical meristem of the plant. The next year's plant parts may in fact end up with fewer culms that will be produced if the plant gets grazed early in the growth season and ends up stimulating the growth of those buds too early. In other words, right at the latter part of the growing season, to such a degree that this new shoot that comes up is incapable of producing replacement buds for the following year. And that's exactly what happens when we continually go back through and have early grazing episodes in which the defoliation is occurring and these apical meristems or the boot stage type of grazing is occurring. That's been shown in a number of studies at Utah State University several years back that Jim Richards was involved in and Brett Olson was involved in. And it's also been repeated down in Texas in a number of locations as well. And so this is a pretty well-known fact that if this boot stage growth and grazing occurs, it will stimulate these buds to produce new tillers and can, in fact, begin to reduce tillers that would be available in the following year. So resting from grazing during that time period is likely to be very critical. And not only is it going to impact the culms that could be produced in the following year, but it likely will impact potentially the production in the following year and even seed production, because if you have fewer stems, you could have fewer possible inflorescences or seeds to be produced. So if the goal is to try and recover these seeds and allow for some regeneration to take place if conditions warrant it, then early grazing may in fact hinder that. Grazing, however, after the inflorescences have been developed, or dormant season grazing, is generally does not harm the plant from that standpoint. The buds remain intact on those plants, and they're sitting there still dormant, waiting for moisture to come along to begin growth in the following fall, or in some locations maybe even the winter or spring. So coming through with livestock and doing some grazing at that time point after the inflorescences have been set and seeds have dropped and the plant has begun to cure, then really does not seem to impact the buds, nor does it seem to impact the growth of the plant in later years. The cover will in fact be reduced because you're removing some of the standing dead material. And so, yeah, there might be some impacts associated with it in terms of ecosystem processes, in that grasses that were large might have captured some snow during the wintertime. A shorter height grass might not capture that snow or prevent as much erosion. And so there could be factors that are associated with these two very early on. Give you a little bit of an example. I'm going to touch on 4 different studies that have looked at grazing and early season versus late season grazing. And so I'll try and walk you through this. This is the first study. This was at a Douglas fir site in Idaho. It actually was dominated by ponderosa pine at the time of the fire. We're going to look on the y-axis at the relative response, the percentage of, in this case, vegetative culms relative to an unburned plant. And first season refers to grazing that occurred first season after fire. Second season is the second year after the fire. And that grazing season was either done early at either the boot stage or slightly before, or late after the boot stage. And what you'll see here is that the culm development in a plant that was ungrazed was nearly twice as high, or even more so, than those that were grazed. However, the late season grazing was less impacted than the early season grazing. And so early season grazing here, once again, is one of those factors probably associated with the fact that stimulating some of those buds, there are then fewer buds that are produced in the following year, and so therefore culm production is declined relative to an ungrazed plant. Now, in this particular case with Idaho fescue, the late season 2-year delay actually had slightly higher culm production. So you're getting to culm productions then that were relatively expected for what would be similar to an ungrazed plant. The second study is another case study, and in the first case as well as the second case, these are both clipping studies, is in a location with either mountain sagebrush or 3-tip sagebrush. In these sites, they both looked at blue bunch wheatgrass and then squirrel tail. They have the number of culms here rather than the relative response. So this is just the direct number of culms. The clear bars are indicating the number of culms that they had in the pre-treatment prior to the clipping. And then these are the number of culms for early, late, and those that were rested. So the third bar here are the ones that are not being grazed a year or two afterwards. And so this is early was once again either at the boot stage or slightly before. Late was after seed dispersal. And once again, you can see that there tends to be the reduction in culm production associated with the early grazing in both sites that they looked at. Okay, many people complain that clipping studies don't relate to what actually happens with livestock. So now we'll look at a study that was done in three-tip sage. This is over at the Du Bois Sheep Station. Once again, we're going to look at the, in this case, the change in cover from 2001 to 2004, 2001 being slightly before the fire, 2004 after the fire, all perennial grasses in the top grass, blue bunch wheatgrass in the bottom grass. And then the dark bar is the no grazing control. And then we have the clear bars here being the plants that were grazed the first year, second year, and third year after the fire. The next bar being ones that were delayed until the second year and were grazed the second and third year. And then the hatched bar here is only being grazed at the third year. And then this group is those where the grazing occurred in the fall versus those where the grazing occurred in the spring. Okay, you can see that the grazing, and this is a percent change relative to that 2001 level. Almost all of the treatments showed an increase in cover relative to the 2001 levels. The non-grazed one was higher than those of the grazing. However, the fall and spring grazing on these two does not show a significant difference from that level. And so there is a reduction in terms of the cover. That's largely associated with the actual removal that was being grazed. But in all cases here, the cover was greater by 2004 than it was 2001 prior to the fire. And then the last one that we'll look at is a Wyoming big sagebrush site. This was work that was done over in Burns. I've selected a couple of the graphs out of the paper that was done here. The top one is looking at the herbaceous current year's growth, and then the bottom one is looking at seed production. Both are in kilograms per hectare. And in this particular case, the fire occurs in year 0. The analysis for both of these was actually looked at in years 3 and 4 after the fire. Going from left to right in the bars is what happens in terms of unburned. And then the second bar over is what happens with burning but no grazing. And then the next two bars are summer grazing, so this would be the equivalent to dormant season grazing. And then the last two bars in this particular case are more where the grazing is being done during that boot stage or pre-boot stage. And there does seem to be a slight reduction in the herbaceous biomass. However, there only is a significant difference with that of the burned ungrazed. And there was no difference between, by the third year, there was no difference between the early season grazing and the late season grazing. Actually, I had these reversed in terms of the way that I was pointing at them, late season versus early season grazing, in terms of the herbaceous biomass. Seed production tends to follow a similar kind of factor, much more variable in year 4 than it was in year 3, with the seed production of the unburned plants being higher than any of the grazed plants, but all of the grazed treatments by year 4 were producing roughly about the same amount of seed. So unfortunately, we don't have a real strong comparison here at years 1 and years 2 for these. This was only looking out at years 3 and 4 after the fire. So what can we conclude from those 4 studies? And they are the 4 studies that I know of that are in the Intermountain West that are relative to this. 2 of them used clipping and 2 of them used animals. 3 of the 4 are single-site case studies where they're only looking at it in one location where a fire occurred. And that's always, oftentimes, a problem in many of our projects because we're taking advantage of the wildfire that has occurred in an area. But the findings show that grazing with no rest had some mixed results, with certainly the, What am I doing? I'm going backwards. Okay. With the dormant season grazing showing the least impact, and then the grazing during the growing season, certainly immediately after the fire, showing the largest amount of impact. There are species-specific results that seem to show up in these studies. In some cases, things like Idaho fescue is highly susceptible to fire intensity, and so that would be one that could be a concern in certain locations if you're dealing with a fire that's burning through that community. And then if you know that most of your herbaceous material, especially the grasses, are located underneath shrubs, and a fire has burned through and removed the shrubs, then those are likely to be ones that could be highly susceptible to mortality on sites. And so a concern to be considered in trying to set objectives. But what wasn't studied in these? Well, generally ground cover in and of itself for erosion protection wasn't looked at. The one study actually looked at just change in cover of the vegetation. And one thing that one could consider would be to compare an area that is showing some sort of a slight to moderate or no departure from what would be expected on an ecological site, such as we would do at, with Rangeland Health, and look for some minimum level of cover to be achieved before grazing might be implemented. Maybe that's 50%, maybe it's higher than that. I'm merely throwing out numbers here because I only know of at least one example where somebody used something similar to this, but we have no studies to really show this. Plant composition and structural functional groups. We could relate some statements associated with objectives that might reflect the composition of the post-burn community that we're trying to achieve, either based on cover or based on biomass, and make that relative to what the ecological site would say should be there on those areas. And maybe we need to achieve some proportion of that, and one could use something along the lines of a similarity index to try and achieve that kind of compositional makeup of the perennial plants. What about comparisons to unburned sites? It would help in setting comparative objectives to really know what an unburned site, a burned and ungrazed site looks like, and a burned and grazed site looks like, so that we can have a better idea of what we can use for comparisons. Every year, the climate is oftentimes slightly different, so this can impact many of the communities. And so the growth that we see on these plants can change just due to the weather from one year to the next. All right, switching rehab and restoration, and then looking at grazing. Really, what is out there is basically, as far as I can tell, mostly expert opinion and observations, and it relies on some of the experts in the early, mid-1900s and some of their work. And a lot of this has been summarized in Richard Stevens' chapter in Steve Monson's Volume 1 of this GTR. I've seen some references on the internet to a study by Bruce and others in 2007 and professional animal scientists. However, that particular article, the seeding itself, which was an aerial seeding, failed. And so really we were only able to then look at what might have occurred with just livestock grazing with and without or associated with the residual plant community. So it really does not get at the rehab and restoration aspect. So what I'm going to do is show you a couple of tables that come out of that chapter that Steve Monson has, because I think that this, or that Richard Stevens produced, this really is what has been referred to oftentimes for the minimum number of years of rest. And to give you an example here, mountain big sagebrush communities, the recommendation is that a minimum of 2 years 2 growing seasons with no livestock grazing to allow that plant community to recover. In comparison to a Wyoming big sagebrush community that's below 12 inches of annual precipitation, the recommendation was up to 4 years. And then on top of that, they talk about adding to the minimum number of years for different things that might impact these areas. So let's say you've got something like a poor seed bed conditions, you'd add a year. Or seedings in cheatgrass and red brome or medusa head, so invasive species, you might add 1 to 3 years to be able to allow those plants to grow even further, recognizing that there's going to be competition with those species and getting those the rehab plants established. And so these are recommendations on top of the minimum. And then they talk about specifics associated with plants and how quickly they grow. Certain plants grow very fast, so bottlebrush squirreltail is listed amongst this group. Intermediate growth plants, blue bunch wheatgrass. Slow growing plants, 3 to 4 years for big sagebrush. Bitterbrush, even slower, so 4 to 6 years. So those are recommendations that came from experts. I can't say that I can draw upon articles that can support all of those numbers, but I think that we're basing that upon their opinions and a lot of work that they were involved in. So, setting objectives for resuming grazing in an area that has no rehabilitation. Well, if it's a resilient herbaceous community, then at or below some acceptable exposed bare ground percentage might be something that one would put in there as an objective. Certainly the level of culms or possibly inflorescence productions relative to unburned plants or dormant plants, one could use either dormant or early season grazing and make comparisons on these. But I think that you want to achieve some response associated with at least the perennial grasses, especially in these areas where grasses are so prominent in the Intermountain West. And then potentially using production of perennial plants relative to what the ecological site says would be the range for that plant community in that area, looking at the perennial plants, not looking at annuals on those landscapes. So trying to achieve some of these or all of these could be placed into objectives that one would set. With rehabilitations, the seedlings, getting seedlings to a point where they become reproductive, certainly producing inflorescences by those culms. We would also like to be able to have those plants achieve some sort of level of coverage on the ground surface. So some level of it could be measured by the amount of bare ground that's actually on the area, which would then include both the protection by the plants as well as the protection by litter. And then seedlings that are being produced, one would look at some minimum set of vegetative culms. And we would need to look at how quickly do these plants reestablish vegetative culms after a seeding is successful. And if a seeding fails, well, we should be prepared to resume grazing as a control of fuel loads. And I know that that is done in a number of locations, especially in areas where the invasive annual grasses are prominent. So if a seeding actually does fail, moving the livestock back into those areas to control some of the fuels is probably an important factor. And then lastly, where does the research need to go? Well, I think that we need to be working with the managers and trying to understand what's a reasonable quantitative indicator for resuming grazing. It's not practical to compare to look at just culm numbers of a plant. We need to have something to compare it to in a landscape. And so maybe the unburned plant comb numbers with a plant with similar basal area or something along those lines. I think we need to look at what are their options available for setting these quantitative objectives. We need to move away from trying to prove that the 2-year minimum policy is a bad thing and really get into what are the indicators that can help us in looking at how well that plant community will respond and reflect to the weather variations that we have annually. So based on that, I'd really like to get input from others as to what works, what doesn't work, and what have you seen. So I guess we'll try this discussion part of this and open it up and see what works.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Can you hear me all right?
I can.
Okay, great. I'm getting a little echo back. So thank you so much. We will now open the floor for discussion. So please type your questions or unmute requests in the question window on your control panel, and I'll do my best to pronounce your name correctly. The first question is from Bruce Silito, and he asks, does the 2-year minimum rest mean 2 growing seasons or 2 calendar years?
That's a good question, and in the article that Richard Stevens put together in that general technical report, it's 2 growing seasons. And so that's really what they're looking at, is allowing the plants to grow without livestock grazing for 2 complete growing seasons.
Okay, thanks. Dustin Kavitz commented on a slide, one of your earlier slides where you were talking about keeping native plants on the land to prevent erosion. His comment is also that it's not only to prevent erosion, but to prevent invasion of invasive plant species as well. And let's see.
That's a good point. And one of the things that we found in looking at the rehab monitoring information is that we oftentimes monitor just the seeded plants on an area, but we also need to really monitor the invasive species as well to make sure that we're effective at reducing or at least keeping them in check.
Great. The next question is from Faith Ryan. This was referring to the Bunting et al. Study. She asks, what time of year was the fire in this situation?
Trying to think. I believe it was, I've got the article here, so let me take a real quick look.
Okay.
I'm not seeing it right off the top of my head. I'm sorry.
That's okay. We'll get back to her. Donald Serrano asks, are there any studies relating to grazing on high severity burn areas that have been reseeded? Recommendations for post-grazing management?
No, the real problem that I came across was that when it comes to revegetation projects after fires, there really is a dearth of studies. There are very few studies out there that have actually looked at the livestock grazing and the reintroduction and what was it done, what does it do? We know that plants early can be susceptible to, and on certain soils can be susceptible to being pulled out of the ground by livestock. Cattle are more apt to pull plants out than sheep are, just because of the way in which the grazing action takes place. But there are very few studies that have really looked at the reintroduction of grazing on rehab projects, and so this is an area that really needs to have some work, and where the scientists need to work with the managers in setting up some good studies on this.
Okay. Cameron Boyce asks, for sites with poor seed bed conditions, could grazing help to create safe sites for seeding establishment if timed correctly?
That's a good question. And I have seen situations where this has worked fairly well, but it's hit and miss. And this is where we need better monitoring to be able to do this. If we do things like aerial seeding, there have been situations where livestock have been brought into an area, allowed to go through and graze during the dormant season, thereby trampling the seed into the ground, and there can be seed establishment occur. I've seen a ranch for myself down in Utah in which that took place, and it worked really well. I've also heard of examples of where it hasn't worked well. And so what are the situations in which it does work, and when does it work is a very important factor. I think that you need to have the seed on the ground. The livestock trampling needs to be during the time period when that seed can actually get into the ground. So if the ground is merely dry and hard, the trampling is probably not going to do very much. However, if the soil is pliable during the time that the livestock come in there, they may in fact be giving that seed better seed-to-soil contact and maybe helping in getting seedlings to germinate and grow. So it's an area that we need to follow up with either better monitoring or actual research projects associated with it.
Okay, thanks. Brooke Shakespeare asks, what about browsing of herbaceous species, especially those in the riparian, e.g. cottonwood? How much rest is needed for those?
That's a good question too. I ran across some information and in the on that, and I don't know specifically with cottonwood, but I have seen indications that there's a need to have greater lengths of time in the riparian area, especially if the riparian area has burned, largely to allow those trees and shrubs to get tall enough to where, especially for those that are highly palatable, that they won't just merely become hedged during the grazing episodes as livestock come back into those areas. I can't pinpoint a number associated with that particular species.
Okay, thank you. Lara Duran asks, does the length of rest vary if the objectives are to increase forb diversity and abundance as opposed to increase grass cover, etc.?
If for forbs, generally fires stimulate forbs if the perennial forbs are in those areas. And so most of the studies that looked at forbs post-fire found that there was higher reproduction that occurred on those forbs immediately after the fire. And so therefore, if the livestock were to come into those areas and graze prior to inflorescence production, then there would be a risk of reducing the forbs and the potential for those forbs to be adding seeds to the seed bank. And so, yes, if your objective is to increase forbs on those areas, one could argue that delaying livestock grazing until you've had at least a couple of years of seed production on those would be good. Most of the studies, and they're limited, most of the studies show that increase in floral production associated with the forbs occurs in those first couple of years. And so probably by year 3 or year 4, the advantage that would have been gained is probably no longer there. And so really it's those first couple of years because what they're doing is they're utilizing the nitrogen that's available right after the fire, and there's a great amount of growth that's occurring on the forbs.
Thank you. Brandon Napton asks, does the growing season end at seed set or dissemination?
That's a good question. Yeah, and that would depend on species, I guess, too. For most of our native plants, they tend to disperse seeds shortly after they ripen the seeds. That's not necessarily the case with the introduced forage plants, both in terms of forbs and grasses. Some of those actually retain the seeds much longer. I think that, but by that time, the seeds don't tend to be the palatable part that the plant is going for, or that the animal is going for. And so, so I would say that allowing for dispersal of the native plant seeds is probably the thing that you're looking for, and getting those perennial plants to become truly dormant. So if they're moving into the dormancy phase for that year, then I think you're probably at that stage entering into the phase that would be less impact on the plant.
Thank you. Dan Brunkhorst asks, what are the recommended seasons and length of rest for woody shrub reestablishment?
For woody shrub reestablishment, well, the length of season. Now, I'm assuming that he's talking about in a revegetation project, and I'll try and answer it both ways. In a revegetation project, that period of growth, or the period of time, usually requires, I think they had on that table that I showed for things like sagebrush, anywhere from 3 to 4 years on that, and up to 6 years for things like bitterbrush. Now that's a recommendation. Regrowth and expectation of natural seeding of many of our perennial shrubs without a rehabilitation project, that would that's going to be hit and miss, because you're really depending upon actually having seeds in the seed bank to even produce those seedlings. And so I think that you almost have to answer that question more associated with a rehabilitation, revegetation type project after a fire, because I don't know that you can depend on the seed bank being there to allow for germination and growth of the shrubs. That oftentimes takes a 1 in 10 year event to actually get the shrubs established naturally in an area.
Okay, thank you. Julie Smith asks, will this slideshow be made available after the webinar? Well, Dave, if that's all right with you, I can post it on our website. So
that's fine with me.
All right, then it will be. Dustin Kavitz asks, how do you incorporate a 4-year deferment on Wyoming big sagebrush dominated sites into a grazing plan?
Boy, I'm probably not the right person to ask on that. I mean, that's a difficult situation, because you're looking at what are your options in terms of taking a leaseholder associated with an allotment and trying to work with them to move them to an area that that hasn't been impacted. I'm probably, in that particular case, I'm going to plead ignorance and say that I'm not a manager and I haven't had to deal with that situation. So there's probably better people to ask.
Okay. Cameron Boyce asks, it seems to me, at least in our area, that no matter what the rest period is, it is still precipitation dependent. While waiting for rain, invasive annuals can become dominant.
Yeah, that's true. and it depends on when the rain comes and the season of the rain and those kinds of things. However, you have to plan, and because the livestock operator has to be informed and involved in this, you can't you can't be telling them that they have to move their livestock out or move their livestock back into particular areas. The recovery of plants, if there are residual plants in those landscapes, and I want to emphasize the point that we need to do a better job of monitoring the residual plants after fires. If there are residual plants and the weather is not conducive for their growth, then any grazing that occurs on those residual perennial plants is likely to be an additional stress on that plant if it's occurring during the growing season. And so you're put into a situation where, yes, the invasive annuals may in fact be growing on those areas, but it's the luck of the draw sometimes as to how precipitation falls and whether you get a good year or you don't get a good year. I think you have to plan in hopes of having a good year, and then make adjustments. Otherwise, if a seeding fails, or be prepared to delay in terms of the growth until you get that until you get the expected amount of growth that you want to have on those plants prior to allowing the livestock grazing to come back in.
Okay, Cameron follows up with, could targeted grazing be used to address invasive annuals while protecting perennials?
That's a good question, and I'm one who sits on the fence on that one. I'm not an advocate, nor am I moving away from this, but I don't think that we have good studies yet to show it. I've heard of examples of it working. I've heard of one example where the livestock grazing occurred very early in the season, and where the livestock then were in fact selecting for cheatgrass in areas, and so therefore reducing the growth of the cheatgrass. But once again, depending upon what happens in terms of the weather conditions, I mean, I did my PhD on grazing of cheatgrass, and given moisture, I could graze that plant down to the ground on a weekly basis for 5 months, literally for 5 months. And provided there was adequate moisture, that plant still would produce seeds. So it was a smaller plant, but it produced viable seeds each time. So I'm not sure. I think it's weather dependent as well as having appropriate grazing management. And this is an area of active research where we need really good studies that are looking at not just the animal response, but the plant response as well, and not just looking for a reduction in biomass or cover of cheatgrass, but a reduction in the seeds and the densities of the plants. We really need to deal with it in a population basis, because that's how cheatgrass catches up with it.
Okay, thanks. Brandon Napton asks, how does removal of above-ground biomass affect overwinter survival of seedlings or young plants versus mature residual plants?
Read that one to me again.
How does removal of above-ground biomass affect overwinter survival of seedlings or young plants versus mature residual plants?
Okay, so it's going to, once again, it will depend upon whether that removal of biomass is occurring during the active growing season or not. If it's a seedling and the biomass is removed during the active growing season, then the plant itself will activate new growth and try to continue to photosynthesize and maintain buds or maintain growth. If that plant uses all of the buds to try and maintain that growth by activating the axillary buds on the seedling, it has very few buds available as a seedling. And so if that occurs during a time period when it's a seedling, then it's highly susceptible to not being able to withstand the growth in the following year. Generally, that doesn't occur too often in areas if you've got enough residual grass, because the livestock aren't going to go for the seedlings because they generally tend to be too small. Trampling action can be more harmful. The mature plants, the removal of the biomass is really a reflection of, like what I explained earlier with that diagram of the grass, is it depends on when the removal occurs. Removal at a point where you stimulate the axillary buds and the tillers during that same growing season is more detrimental to the plant than removal of the biomass after the plant becomes dormant during either the summer or the fall. A mature plant generally has much more, many more buds to allow it to continue to grow, and has a greater photosynthetic capacity to be able to regrow after a grazing episode than a seedling does. Not sure that I answered that question the way you wanted, or not sure what he really was getting at with the question, I guess.
All right, well, if that didn't answer your question, Brandon, please, you can type in more. All right, the next question is from Angela Safranek. What if we are talking about recovery of woody species that re-sprout, like sand sage?
Yeah, that's a good question, too. I think you behave in the same way that you would with perennial grasses. There's a period of time that you would like those shoots to, I mean, if this is a desirable plant that you want in the landscape, then you want those plants to reestablish those shoots. If it's a desirable plant and a palatable plant, then trying to get that plant large enough to where that it has adequate buds on the stems or the root bases to regrow after a grazing episode as well. And so things like bitterbrush can activate buds almost anywhere on a branch, whereas sagebrush cannot. The only active buds on big sagebrush, it cannot. So the only active buds on big sagebrush are those that are associated with the actual leaves on the current year's growth. That's why it's so susceptible to browsing in areas where deer winter range where it's being utilized. For other species, it really depends upon how they regrow after a grazing episode, but I think I would want to make sure that I had enough branches that were actively growing above ground to get a couple of years of growth, and it depends on how quickly those grow. So it really is species specific when it comes to those kinds of questions.
Okay, thanks. Dustin Kavitz asks, was wildlife use, i.e. elk use, considered in these studies?
The two that used grazing did not consider it. They were actually short duration, high intensity grazing episodes in small pastures and paddocks. So they did not have wildlife.
Okay, thanks. Tina Marion asks, are there suggestions of how to respond to public pressure not to graze an area after a fire? They don't want it grazed because there is a higher prevalence of cheatgrass as a result of the fire.
Read that again.
Are there suggestions of how to respond to public pressure not to graze an area after a fire? They don't want it grazed because there is a higher prevalence of cheatgrass as a result of the fire.
I think she means to say that they want it grazed because there's a higher prevalence of cheatgrass after the fires.
Okay.
I mean, it's a catch-22 because there are going to be people that don't want you to use livestock or allow livestock grazing to occur on an area, and there are people that are going to want you to keep the livestock grazing off as long as possible. And I think what you have to do is you have to look at that ecosystem and the vegetation communities that are on them, and how what was there before the fire. That area was already cheatgrass before, and it was dominated by cheatgrass, and you're not going in and doing a revegetation project on that area, then I guess I would argue very heavily that livestock grazing on that area might be a good way of being able to keep the fuels at relatively minimum levels. However, if you're trying to stimulate growth of the residual perennial plants that are there after the fire, those plants, if you introduce grazing too early, those plants are going to be susceptible to the grazing stress as well as the stress associated with the fire and trying to recover their photosynthetically active material. I'm not sure that I'm probably not answering this question very well because I can understand where people have concerns. I think you have to walk them through what did that community look like prior to the fire, and how do we expect it to respond after the fire, and what are we trying to do by reducing grazing on that area, and be realistic. Can we achieve what we're trying to achieve with by keeping grazing off? Because if the perennial plants aren't there, they aren't going to respond. I mean, they have to be there as part of the residual community and have survived the fire. I think trying to rely on seed production by the residual plants that survived the fire to reproduce and then establish new seedlings in an area that has cheatgrass is going to be a difficult road to go down. And if you're trying to do that, you're probably better off coming in with a rehabilitation project.
Okay, thank you. Stephanie Coleman asks, do you make a distinction between cool and warm season growing plants and what you've told us, as we have dominantly warm season forage plants in the Southwest, Apache sitgreaves?
I thought about that question, and I thought, well, am I going to address it or not? Yeah, that's a whole different ballgame because you have to deal with the growing season of those plants. So you've got two active growing seasons down there, and depending upon when the fire is occurring, you've got to be aware of the fact that you could be impacting the warm season plants by grazing during those times. Now, the advantage that warm season plants have generally in the Southwest, provided that you have precipitation, which hasn't been the case at least in this year in certain locations in the Southwest, but provided you have the summer precipitation, the moisture is there for the plant to continue to immediately regrow after the grazing episode. And so that's why studies in the shortgrass prairie and midgrass prairie with fires that are occurring in their dry season, which oftentimes is late winter, that those plants will grow quite quickly. So you have, and they can withstand grazing, I think, fairly early on. So it is definitely different when you're dealing with warm season plants, but recognize the fact if you have a mixture of warm and cool season plants, when you reintroduce that grazing, you need to make sure that it's not going to impact either one or the other functional group that you have within that community, because you're dealing with two different functional groups, and if you severely impact one, you could tip the balance in the structural or the functional groups to favor either warm season or cool season plants based on the livestock grazing. But that's fairly typical of how grazing is done in those areas, and it can be tipped in one direction or another.
Okay, thank you. Tina Marion, who asked the previous question about grazing post-fire and public pressure, wanted to note that this is in a situation where the area has already rested for 3 years. So I'm not sure if that would change your answer, but I thought I should let you know.
Okay, so the area is already rested in 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
I think what I would have to do is to look at what do I have in terms of perennial plants on that area. And am I expecting that I'm going to see any more? Because if you're dealing with an area that has invasive annual grasses in it already, then if you're expecting to see reproduction from the residual perennial plants, and that those seeds are going to be expected to germinate and establish in competition with the invasive annual grasses, then that's going to be a tough road to go down. I think you have to be realistic as to what you have in those areas. Now, if you take Richard Stevens' approach for looking at the timing of an area with rehabilitation, if you had rehabilitation on those areas and you've got invasive annual grasses, he says, take the minimum and add another 3 years to it, just to allow those plants to continue to grow and reproduce and get established, fully established. I've seen one situation, and this is just observations, of an area that in the first 5 years or so after the fire looked like it was almost all cheatgrass, and they kept grazing off of it for almost 7 years, I believe it was. It was the Glass Butte fire. And after that, the residual perennial plants did, in fact, come back and begin to check the cheatgrass in the area. But they knew that they had a good density of residual plants there, and they allowed them to grow. And so if you've got a good density, and a density that you would expect to have in that community in a healthy ecosystem, then allowing more time for growth might be advantageous. But if you know that you don't have the density of the plants, and they're few and far between for the perennial plants, then you might want to consider at that point going ahead and reintroducing livestock grazing.
Okay, thanks. Allison Dean asks a question for me. Could a transcript of this post-slideshow discussion be made available in addition to the slideshow itself? And yes, our web developer does that. It takes a while, though. It might take a couple weeks, but that will be posted on our Great Basin Science Delivery Project website. And I can send out an email letting people know when it's available. Okay, the next question for Dave. Laura Duran asks, does the number of AUMs, number of cows, sheep, stocking density, etc., change the length of rest time?
In my mind, I don't think that it does. I mean, yes, probably so. If you reduce the numbers down to very low levels, you might be able to do that. Once again, grazing season becomes important. So what time of year are you grazing? The grazing occurring. And we know from the one thing that there have been repeated studies on is that stocking rate seems to be the best tool to use in terms of understanding the response of productivity of an ecosystem that's been grazed. So high stocking rates will generally reduce the productivity on a site, whereas intermediate to lower stocking rates will end up allowing for greater productivity of that site. So yes, if you got the animal numbers down low enough to where that stocking rate was quite low and grazing ended up being quite light so that many of the plants weren't in fact being grazed, you're probably looking at the same kind of impact that you might have with wildlife moving through an area. But how low is low enough? And then, like I said, grazing season I still think plays probably one of the more important roles. And the worst time to be out there grazing is the time at which that apical meristem's moving up through the culms of those grasses, because because of the whole bud response that the grass goes through. So yeah, I think you could moderate things by reducing AUMs, but it has to be low enough to where it would be very, very light grazing, I think.
Okay, thank you. Cameron Boyce asks, or states, I think we need grass banks or some alternative to operators on burn areas. Otherwise, many may be put out of business with lengthy rest periods.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it's my understanding that there are certain locations that have actually gone that route of having some grass bank locations available for those years when they have fires that move through an area in such that they can move a livestock operator's operation to a grass bank allotment to allow them some flexibility, and because it's quite frankly they either are going to have to cull the animals from the herd or trying to find alternative locations to be able to take their livestock to may be difficult. So economically, it's a tough deal for the livestock operator.
Okay. 3 more questions. Brandon Napton, who had asked earlier about how does removal of above-ground biomass affect overwinter survival of seedlings in young plants versus mature, he followed up with, I was getting at thermal protection of the growth points of seedlings. Will opportunities for early green-up be affected?
That's a good question. I mean, with a seedling, generally there's not enough shading or insulation that's going on that you have to worry about it. And so you're probably not getting much of an impact that way. With the mature plant, one could argue that you're changing the ability for that plant to gain some long-wave radiation, which would then create some warming during times with moisture and might cause for earlier regrowth. Yeah, a lot of trade-offs there. I have to think about that one more.
Okay. We can get back to you, Brandon. So Tom Hilkin asks, so a general rule of thumb is that riparian areas with a strong shrub component will generally require longer rest period than associated uplands predominantly comprised of perennial bunch grasses.
Good comment. Thanks, Tom. Yeah, that's the kind of information that I had read. I just didn't put it into the presentation. Largely that, it has a lot to do with, especially if that riparian area is open to livestock grazing. If the area has burned both the uplands and the riparian area, the livestock oftentimes, if left to their own recourse, will move down into that riparian area and concentrate into that area. So unless there's either fencing or herding to try and keep them out of it, they tend to concentrate on those locations, and so therefore the plants in those areas are highly susceptible to the grazing stress on top of the fire stress. Thanks, Tom. That's a good comment.
All right, Alan Bass asks, has there been longer-term studies looking at site functionality after livestock have been grazing post-fire, say 6 to 8 years, compared to no livestock grazing on the same fire? One may assume that keeping livestock off may rapidly increase the rate of recovery, but can livestock be allowed and still allow ecological processes to improve and maintain site functionality, albeit at a slower pace?
My recollection is that the only study that's looked at something long-term is the Bates study that I referred to in the presentation, and that was really showing that by the time you're getting out to 3 and 4 years after the fire, you had pretty good recovery on those areas. Now that was an area that had a really pretty good stand of shrub grass stand. It had been moderately grazed in the area, and then was kept under pretty close grazing for the post-fire grazing, and so it was well documented. And I think that there is a point at which you're not going to achieve anything further on those lands. Now, on that Bates study, one of the interesting things was that the last 2 years, which were the ones that they did a lot of the reporting of the results, the last 2 years were at about the average precipitation for that area. Now, how much that played into the results that they got, because the first 3 years were dry. And so what is the impact of climate or weather for any particular fire in any particular location? This is why, rather than, we really need to have multiple studies done in a similar fashion, looking at similar types of results over many years with many different fires. Because we try and draw these generalities, and most of the results that we look at are, unfortunately, they're good studies, but they reflect just that location and the conditions under which they operated, and we can't draw oftentimes very good, clear conclusions with each of those because they're all so different. So I guess I get on my soapbox and say, we need to work with managers, and we also, the difficulty is you're dealing with fires that are a somewhat random occurrence, because wildfires are different than prescribed fires, and so we'd like to deal with it from a wildfire standpoint. We need to have livestock operators that are willing to work with us and adhere to the protocols so we can make comparisons. And we need to have managers that are willing to work with the research community to allow us to set up the studies so that they would all be similar. And you know, we've been very fortunate with the Sage Step project to be able to set up a series of prescribed burns and surrogates to prescribed burning. But that's been very expensive and required a lot of cooperation to be able to make it happen. The same would need to be done if we were going to deal with this particular type of question, I think, over a larger scale in a particular region.
Okay, great.
So,
go ahead.
We'll want to do it. I'd really love to be involved.
All right, we'll have to get some people together. One final comment from Allison Dean. She says, the Nature Conservancy has partnered with local landowners and federal agencies in Central Oregon to provide grass banks for post-fire grazing rotation. Perhaps a similar collaboration could work in other places.
Excellent, excellent. That's a great tool, and we need to start looking for those kinds of options in other locations as well. Good.
Great. Well, that's it for questions, and no one requested that their mic be open. And Dave, thank you so much for hanging in with us for an additional half hour, and half of our attendees are still here too, so thank you, everybody. I just want to let you know that a recording of this webinar will be sent to you automatically through the GoToWebinar system tomorrow, and then I will additionally post it on the Great Basin Science Delivery Project website, hopefully by the end of this week or early next week. And I just want to apologize in advance, even though I wrote at the beginning of my notes, press record before you start talking, I actually forgot to press record until like right after Dave's intro slide, so I do apologize about that. Okay, well, thanks, Dave. Any final comments? Or?
No, thank you. It's been fun.
Okay, and you've got a lot of thank yous on the from the attendees in the questions box. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
All right. See you later, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.